Pro-social behavior, and that's in chapter 11. And then in chapter 12, we're going to talk about aggression and why people are so angry and whatnot. But first, we're going to talk about good people, the people that are happy, people that do things for other people. 1977, Everett Sanderson jumped down on the subway tracks to save the life of Michelle De Jesus only seconds before the onrushing train would have struck her. After failing to jump back onto the platform, Sanderson was pulled to safety at the last instant by onlookers. In 1999, David Hutmacher was diagnosed with diverticulitis that required him to miss 6 months of work. With Christmas approaching and his sick and personal leave running out, David was surprised to discover his paychecks continuing to be full. David's coworkers had donated their own sick and personal leave to make up his shortfall. In 1999, athlete Yukiko Marth developed an aggressive form of glomerulonephritis that required an immediate kidney transplant. Charlie Keys, a person that she had a passing acquaintance with, donated a kidney and saved Yukiko's life. Al-Qaeda terrorist Usman Khan attacked the patrons of a London museum with knives and a suicide vest in 2019. After killing 2 patrons and wounding 3, Darren Frost and John Crilly chased Khan out of the building and onto London Bridge, where they parried the knives with a 5-foot narwhal tusk and a fire extinguisher before Khan was shot and killed. This is Khan and this is Darren Frost. And there are the 2 of them. This is John Crilly over here. In 2007, Cameron Holopeter was waiting for a subway train when he suffered a seizure that threw him onto the tracks. Wesley Autry, seeing the dilemma, jumped onto the tracks and was able to roll the unconscious man into a trench and cover him before a train crushed them both. And this is Wesley Autry, and this was Cameron Holopeter. In 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into the frozen Potomac River in Washington, D.C. 5 passengers and a flight attendant clung to wreckage in the frozen river as a helicopter plucked them off the debris one by one. Ignoring his own safety, Arland Williams helped the other 5 survivors attach themselves to the rescue rope to be whisked to safety. When they went back for Williams, the cold had claimed him and he slipped into the water and died. African-American Otis Gaither smashed through the door of a burning mobile home one night and pulled white Larry Whitten to safety. When Whitten failed to respond, Gaither applied CPR despite the racist symbol that fluttered over the burning structure. And it was the rebel battle flag. The Avenue of the Righteous among the nations is a line of trees planted commemorating hundreds of Europeans who saved Jews during Hitler's Holocaust. At great peril to themselves, they provided haven and food for members of the hunted religion. Avenue of the Righteous. Samaritans were people of mixed Assyrian and Israeli ancestry who maintained a religion that was similar but not exactly the same as the Israelis. Because they were different, they were despised by the Israelis. One day, an Israeli merchant was robbed, stripped, and left for dead along the road. A priest and a Levite saw him and hustled away, seeing his nakedness and not wanting to soil themselves. A Samaritan came along and bound the merchant's wounds and carried him to an inn to recuperate. He gave the innkeeper a sum of money and promised to make up any difference if his need exceeded the money that he left. Altruism is the act of concern, and of course, the truth was that this man was Jewish, and these guys were Jewish, but they wouldn't have anything to do with him because they were afraid it would taint them. This was a Samaritan, and a Samaritan, despite the fact that he was a despised minority in Israel, bound the man's wounds and took him to an inn to recuperate. And theoretically, since he was so different from this man, he shouldn't have been able to do that. Theoretically, the 2 Jewish people, because they were of the same of the same faith, they should have helped him, but they didn't. Altruism is the active concern and helping of someone else with no expectation of gaining anything in return. Why people help has been the subject of much research. The social exchange theory purports that people weigh the costs of such interactions and seek to maximize their rewards and minimize their costs. Rewards provided for helping may be external or internal. External rewards may be in the form of appreciation or friendship. Therefore, we are more likely to help someone whose approval we desire, someone attractive to us. Internal rewards include increased feelings of self-worth, but it also includes reducing the feelings of distress that one might feel caused by the empathy for someone else's pain. Internal rewards. Clary, Almodo, and Snyder researched people who volunteered to help AIDS patients. They found 6 motivations: values, to act on humanitarian values, and concern for others; understanding, to learn about people or learn skills; social, to be part of a group and gain approval; career, to enhance job prospects with experience and contacts; ego protection, to reduce guilt or escape personal problems; and esteem enhancement, to boost self-worth and confidence. Some might contend that altruism has so many internal rewards that people do it more for their own benefit than that of the others. Thus, they contend that altruism is a form of egoism, where the real benefit is that of the giving individual. However, Daniel Batson sees altruism as working both as a self-serving and selfless act. Batson referred to our focus on sufferers' distress as empathy, genuine sympathy and compassion for the other individual. Such empathy comes naturally. Other animals will come to another's aid. They will comfort a sufferer. They will comfort a victim. They will show distress at another's emotional response. A newborn baby will cry when they hear another baby crying. Empathy produces helping even toward members of rival groups. With their empathy aroused, people will help even when they believe no one will know about their helping. With their empathy aroused, people will violate their own standards of fairness and justice by giving the person favored treatment. Sometimes people will help others when there is no self-interest involved, but because society prescribes the helping behavior as a norm. There are 2 social norms: reciprocity norms or expectations that if you help a person, they will help and not hurt you. Social responsibility norms are expectations that people will help those dependent upon them. Evolutionary psychology purports that animals are driven to maximize the survival of their own genes. Thus, an individual is more likely to put their children's welfare ahead of their own, though children are less likely to sacrifice themselves for their parents. This kin favoritism is referred to as kin selection, favoritism for those who share our genes. This favoritism may be prevalent with people who aren't actually relatives, but who look similar to us. Evolutionary psychologists also believe that we may help others because we expect others to return the favor, and this is known, of course, as reciprocity. While reciprocity is unlikely to work in large, impersonal urban areas, it does tend to work in small, isolated groups. People in a small group feel closer to the others in the group and will often sacrifice for them, and with understanding that when fortunes are reversed, reciprocity will happen. Large and impersonal sometimes has the opposite effect. In 1964, Kitty Genovese was attacked by a knife-wielding rapist in front of her own apartment house in Queens. For 35 minutes, she fought off her rapist while screaming in terror in the middle of the street. 38 of her neighbors were aroused and observed the attack from the safety of their homes. None helped. None even called the police. Kitty Genovese was raped and died from her wounds. And this is where it happened in New York City. And that's what Kitty Genovese looked like in 1964. Andrew Mormeal was attacked on a crowded subway car. He was knifed in the stomach. His attackers left the car at the next stop. 11 riders watched the man bleed to death as they rode home. An 18-year-old switchboard operator was sexually assaulted while working alone. She escaped out in the street naked and bleeding with her attacker in pursuit. 40 pedestrians watched as the attacker tried to pull her back inside. 2 policemen happened by and stopped the assault. Eleanor Bradley tripped and broke her leg in a crowded street. Dazed and in pain, she pleaded for help. For 40 minutes, shoppers merely parted and flowed around her. A cab driver finally helped her to a doctor. In June of 2000, a parade that wound past Central Park took a turn for the macabre when groups of drunk men began dousing women with water and tearing the clothes off of and fondling the female parade watchers. Ann Payton was forced to negotiate her way home with her underwear torn away. Police ignored the problem and no calls from cell phones were received despite the thousands who watched the attacks. The Kitty Genovese rape and murder was a wake-up call for social psychologists. Unwilling to accept the callousness of Kitty's neighbors, psychologists began researching to discover how and why such egregious crimes can be watched and allowed to continue with no one lifting a finger to help. Researchers discovered that people in large groups are less observant than people in small groups. Research done with smoke pouring from an air vent demonstrated that people in large groups took 4 times as long to see the smoke. Thus, the people in the crowd partying around Eleanor Bradley may not have even noticed Eleanor laying there until after they passed. With advance notice and a less crowded sidewalk, the individual may have been more likely to see Eleanor and evaluate her need. Interpreting, the larger the group of people, the more likely that an individual will accept the implied definition of an event of the group. If everyone else in the group seems unconcerned, an individual is less likely to interpret a situation as negative. This is particularly due to pluralistic ignorance, the mistaken interpretation that others are feeling what we are due to our illusion of transparency, the overestimation of others' ability to read our internal states. Latine and Rodin staged an experiment around a woman in distress. 70% of the individuals when alone responded to the woman's obvious distress. 40% of the pairs responded to the woman's distress. Of the 60% who didn't respond, most interpreted the situation as a non-emergency. As the number of people witnessing the emergency increased, the less likely anyone would render assistance. And this, of course, is called the bystander effect. Assuming responsibility, not only are people more likely to misinterpret an actor's actions while in a group, but they're also more likely to misinterpret the willingness of other bystanders to help. It seems that the more people who witness a situation, the more likely each is to assume that someone else will take responsibility for the situation, a diffused responsibility for the action. Diffusion of responsibility. Studies in large cities and more rural settings show that the fewer the people involved, the more likely people will intervene. Youssef and Corti, looking at New Yorkers' failure time and time again to respond to the aid of other individuals, refers to the atmosphere in large municipalities as sensory overload and compassion fatigue. To exonerate humanity, when people are with people they know, they are more likely to try to help. In 1967, Bryan and Test researched helping patterns in Los Angeles. They discovered that people were more likely to assist a female driver with a flat tire if they observed someone helping a female driver with a flat tire 1/4 of a mile up the road. Bryan and Test went to New Jersey to observe the donation patterns of Christmas shoppers. They found that people were more likely to drop money in a Salvation Army kettle if they had just seen someone else do the same. Rushton and Campbell found that British adults are more willing to donate blood if they are approached after observing someone who has consented to donate blood. One factor of modern life is time restraints that we all live under. A clever experiment by Darley and Batson in 1973 pitted seminary students and a homeless man. After listening to the parable of the Good Samaritan, Two groups of seminary students were confronted with a groaning man on the way to an appointment. For the students under no time constraints, 2/3 stopped to help. Of the students under time constraints, only 10% stopped to help. Now, here's the shocking thing to me. Sure, they just heard the parable of the Good Samaritan, and they saw this man who was in distress. Still, 1/3 of the people that had no time constraints walked right past the guy. 90% who had time constraints walked past him, but it's shocking to me that people are so unwilling to help. Even people that are supposed to be helpers, like seminary students. These are going to be preachers in the future. Researchers have often discovered that people who have been induced to lie will feel guilty to the extent that they seek to reclaim their public image. Even when the guilt is not observed, the subject is more likely to seek retribution by volunteering or redeeming themselves in one way or another. Negative moods. Researchers have delved into the effect of other negative moods other than guilt and discovered that sometimes it causes less help behavior and sometimes more. With children, negative moods tend to decrease helping behavior. With adults, negative moods tend to increase helping behavior. Researchers assume that with the adult mind, self-gratification and inner rewards are more possible than they are with children. When researchers looked at the different generosity of elementary, junior high, and high school students, they discovered that as the children aged, they tended to become more socialized and thus more generous. Agreeing with Piaget's developmental theory, children are born selfish and become more and more altruistic as they develop the ability to see the world from another's point of view. Researchers have discovered that in most cases, when people feel bad, they try to do good deeds to make themselves feel better, except in two circumstances: when they're grieving and when they're angry. They also found that when people feel good, they tend to do good deeds. Looking at personality traits, researchers have discovered that there are individual differences in helpfulness and have shown that these differences persist over time. There are a network of traits that predispose a person toward helpfulness. Those high in emotionality, empathy, and self-efficacy, and high monitoring people are helpful if they think helpfulness will be socially rewarding. Correlational studies looking at 172 studies have shown that when faced with situations where strangers need help that is potentially dangerous, men are more likely to help than females. In safer situations, however, women are slightly more likely to help than men. Eagley and Crowley speculated that over long term, rather than the short term of most experiments, women would be seen as more helpful than men. While there are instances of religious leaders making some fairly significant sacrifices, studies show that intrinsically, religious people are only slightly more likely to help in cases of minor emergencies and spontaneous helping acts. As far as donations are concerned, however, 24% of the population makes 48% of the charitable contributions. Looking at 35 studies that compared help given to men and help given to women, men are more likely to offer help to women than to men. Women offered help equally to both genders. Women are more likely to be offered help than men, and single people are more likely to be offered help than two or more people. Men are more likely to offer help to attractive women over unattractive women. Women tend to seek help more than men. Similarity, people who are not only more likely to like people who are similar to them, but they're more likely to help people who are similar to them. Less than 50% of people dressed differently made change for an individual as compared to 2/3 who were dressed similarly. When race is a factor, people will help unless the bystander effect is in force. Researchers have found that any technique that personalizes bystanders increases willingness to help. Personal request, eye contact, stating one's name, anticipation of interaction. People are more likely to donate blood if the appeal is personal and from a friend. People obviously care about their public image, especially individuals high in self-monitoring. The door-in-the-face technique is a strategy for getting people to help by making a large request that you will no doubt refuse, and then accepting a smaller, more reasonable request. Using the door-in-the-face technique, researchers at Arizona State were able to double their contributions. Researchers, and they do this to me all the time. I have colleges. I've been to a lot of colleges. I've graduated from 5. So I've got a lot of people asking me for money. And what they'll do is they'll call you up and they'll say, we would like you to make a donation. Can you make $1,000 donation? I'll say no. Well, how about a $250 donation? No. Well, what about, could you afford a $35 donation? And I usually don't, because it irritates me that they're using the foot in the door technique to try to get me to contribute money. Researchers and historians have discovered that people tend to create a circle of inclusion about them, of the people that they attribute similar moral values and rules. This is known as moral inclusion. Moral exclusion, on the other hand, are all those people outside the sphere of people seen as similar enough to be included. Researchers and historians have noted that individuals who have no moral model to copy are less likely to maintain an altruistic attitude. Susan Harold has even found that pro-social television programming is modeled. However, if people are rewarded or bribed to do what they already like doing, they may lose the intrinsic reward and see the act as extrinsically motivated, the over-justification effect. And that's the end of altruism. So let's get rid of this one and go to aggression. Okay, this one's not as pleasant. Chapter 12, aggression, hurting others. The world was shocked in 1993 when the body of a 2-year-old boy was found brutally beaten to death. 2 10-year-old boys were implicated in the crime by security camera footage, and this is the footage. These are the 2 boys. They decided that they would kill this little boy, and here is this kid walking him out of the mall. The case of the beating to death of James Bulger confounded police initially because the blows were not characteristically severe enough to indicate an adult. So when they hit this kid and beat him to death, they were only 10 years old, so they didn't really hit him very hard, but they hit him enough that they finally killed him. The world celebrated the destruction of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Not 3 years later, with the increase of unemployment from East Germany, 40 hate groups sprung up to protest immigration. In Rostock in 1992, 45 Turkish immigrants were burned to death in firebombing by German skinheads, and these are German skinheads. You may think, oh, they just look like bald guys. No, they shave their heads to show their fascist ideals. Tension between the majority Hutu and the ruling Tutsi of Rwanda had been going on for centuries. Periodic massacres had taken place between the military, the Tutsi, and the Hutu. In 1994, when a Hutu government came to power, the Hutu went on a rampage that took 750,000 lives. Most of them were Tutsis. Researchers were shocked to discover that a Canadian survey in 1994 showed that 29% of married women had experienced physical and sexual assault from their spouses. 29%, almost 1 out of every 3. The Canadian image of politeness took a heavy blow. The 1990s were a time of increased police presence in the United States and a decrease in crime. However, sensational crime still gripped the headlines. Foreign tourists were robbed and murdered from the airport in Florida. Germans seemed to be prime targets. Ranting teens assaulted women in New York City. 29 students and teachers were killed from 1997 to 1999 in student shootings in Kentucky, Oregon, Mississippi, and Colorado. And since then, it has gotten so much worse. $2 billion a day is spent on arms and armies in the world. In the last 100 years, 250 wars have been fought worldwide, at the cost of 110 million lives. Whereas wars prior to the 20th century tended to be between armies, at least when Europeans were fighting other Europeans, in the 20th century, man learned to make war on entire populations. Aggression is physical or verbal behavior intended to hurt someone. Psychologists identify two types of aggression: hostile aggression and instrumental aggression. Hostile aggression is aggression driven by anger and performed as an end in itself. This type of aggression is also called affective aggression, and this is how people are normally injured. Instrumental aggression is a means to some other end other than injuring the other individual. A child seizing a toy would be instrumental aggression. A child punching another child to take a toy away, that would be hostile aggression. Most murders represent hostile aggression by someone who knows the victim, all too often someone who is or was romantically involved with the victim. The instrumental aggression occurs in murders when the death of the victim furthers the murderers, as the case of the cold calculated killings of crime syndicates, which these are pictures of. The question of many people have asked over the course of humanity is, are humans instinctually aggressive, or is it society that makes them aggressive? Rousseau felt that society made people aggressive, but Freud in his theory sided with Darwin. Human aggression is the extension of the animal instinct that we cannot control. The instinct theory follows the Freudian and Darwinian concept that man is just as aggressive as any animal due to instincts. Darwin and later Freud and Lorenz saw aggression as more adaptive than destructive. Just as males in species will be territorial, humans are selectively territorial as well, protecting their food sources and reproductive potential. However, detractors of the instinct theory argue that there are variations of aggression in different cultures. The detractors also point out that different instinct theories have identified over 14,000 instincts, though this was done before the 1930s. Most have been disproven in time, these 14,000 instincts that humans are theoretically have. The neural aspect of aggression can be studied in both human and animals. Mapping the pathway of aggression, researchers have discovered that human aggressive response is very similar to that of the lowest vertebrates. Thus, aggression is as old as the reptilian brain. Research shows that people who perpetrate egregiously horrendous crimes found that the prefrontal lobe, which acts to reason control of aggression, is 14% smaller in murderers and 15% smaller in antisocial men. Genetic influences. Heredity influences the neural system's sensitivity to aggressive cues. Research with other species shows that aggression can be bred out of a species through selective breeding over several generations. When pedigrees are uncertain or wild species such as wolves are introduced, the outcome can be tragic, as is evidenced by the 4.5 million dog attacks per year. 4.5 million. In 2010, there were 34 fatal dog attacks on humans. Most of the 4.5 million victims were children. Half have been bitten in the face. From 1982 to 2006, the Presa Canario were involved in only 30 attacks, but 6 of them led to death. Between 1982 and 2006, German Shepherd and German Shepherd mixes were involved in 94 attacks, and 13 resulted in death. Between 1982 and 2006, pit bulls were involved in 1,110 attacks, and 104 resulted in death. Between 1982 and 2006, Rottweilers were involved in 409 attacks, and 58 resulted in death. These are Russian women, and they all have pet foxes. And the reason they have pet foxes is because Russian scientists worked on taking the aggressive gene out of foxes. And what they did, well, we'll talk about what they discovered in just a second. I think we will anyway. And as you can see, this is what a red fox looks like. And these guys don't look exactly the same. They could also breed out color. if they want to. Or maybe I won't. No, I won't. Okay, one of the things that they discovered was, as they were breeding out the aggressiveness of the fox, they were also breeding in at exactly the same time floppier ears and shorter noses and less pointed noses. So if you look at this fox, he's got really pointy ears. Anyway, floppy ears have to do with being less aggressive. They were also able to breed a fox that was highly aggressive, and of course those foxes they got rid of. They only kept the foxes that were non-aggressive. Biochemical influences, blood chemistry will change neural sensitivity. Research and police records indicate that violent people are more likely to drink. Violent people are more likely to become aggressive when they become intoxicated. Intoxicated people are more likely to give a stronger shock when instructed to shock a person. They get angrier when they think about relationship conflicts. 4 in 10 violent crimes are committed by people who have been drinking. Just over half of rapists have been drinking before they commit their offense. 80% of women in a college survey who report unwanted intercourse have been drinking or taking drugs before the sexual attack. And 65% of homicides and 55% of in-home fights and assaults, one or both of the individuals involved were drinking. Alcohol is inhibitory. Unfortunately, what it normally inhibits is an individual's reasoning powers. It makes them less self-aware and unable to consider the consequences. Testosterone is also part of the biochemical mix. Aggressive males given drugs to lower their testosterone lose their aggressive tendencies. These individuals tend to be edgier, more impulsive, with a lower tolerance for frustration. When the testosterone levels begins to decline, aggressive tendencies begin to decline as well. Men convicted of unprovoked violent crimes tend to have higher testosterone levels than men who commit nonviolent crimes. Males past puberty with high testosterone levels are more prone to delinquency, hard drug use, and aggressive responses to provocation. In contrast to the aggression causing testosterone, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that controls the effects of testosterone in the hypothalamus. Low serotonin levels have been found in violence-prone children and adults. People at lower socioeconomic levels tend to have low serotonin levels. The frustration-aggression theory was first purported by Dollard and Miller just before World War II. The theory states that when someone is frustrated, they are blocked from achieving their goal-directed behavior. They respond with aggressive behavior. Often the aggression is not directly aimed at the frustrating entity, but is displaced on someone else. It is redirected at someone less dangerous. And this is one of the reasons they gave for World War II. And this is one of the excuses that the Germans gave for invading Poland. They needed land. They were being frustrated. They had lost World War I, and they'd lost all this territory, and now they needed to expand. That was the excuse they gave. And the Japanese gave a similar excuse for invading China and for invading areas around the Pacific Ocean, the Pacific Rim. People living in fragile economic or political environments, people of low socioeconomic status, tend to react to economic disappointments with aggressive behavior, often in the form of crime. Usually these individuals suffer from deprivation, the realization that they don't have what someone else has. Relative to deprivation is the realization that one does not have what a comparable entity has. When aggressive acts are rewarded, the individual may learn to act aggressively in the future. This occurs in youth hockey, on our playgrounds, and with terrorists. When terrorists are negotiated with, terrorist acts begin to increase. When they are punished, they tend to decrease. Albert Bandura first proposed this social learning theory back in the early 60s. His experiments with children modeling aggressive behavior has changed the way that we look at violent television programming and violent sporting events. Children of physically punitive parents tend to use aggression when relating to others. Looking at the genealogy of physically punitive families, such behavior can often be traced back several generations, where the paper trail tends to end, but the abusive physical punishment didn't. 30% of abused children become abusive parents, 4 times the national rate. Absentee parents also lead to violent behavior. 70% of juveniles in detention have only one parent at home. American children raised without fathers are 7 times more likely to be abused, to drop out of school, to become runaways, to become unmarried teenage parents, and to commit violent crimes. 2-parent families have increased care, more positive discipline, more educational achievement, fewer uprootings, and higher income. The subculture of violence researchers have discovered that certain types of people have gravitated to areas of the country where they could act out their aggression. Southerners tend to advocate violence and corporal punishment. Murder rates are 4 times that of the average northern city, and spanking is more prevalent. 18% of non-white and 36% of white Southerners believe that a man has the right to kill to protect his home, and are twice as likely to own a gun as a Midwesterner. Researchers have discovered that pain induces both humans and other species to strike out at the closest target. Leonard Berkowitz has found that aversive stimulation from pain to irritating conditions, uncomfortable noise, or temperature can trigger hostile aggression. This aversive stimulation can even take the form of dashed expectations and personal insults. Researchers have long speculated that the warmer the temperature, the more aggressively people act. Drivers in Phoenix without air conditioners often react aggressively when stopped in traffic. Pitchers beam more batters during 90-degree heat weather in weather than weather below 80 degrees, though their control is comparable in both temperature ranges. Riots in the U.S. during the 60s and 70s tended to occur in hot weather as compared to cool weather. And these are the Newark riots of 1967, a picture of the Newark riots, which happened during a heat wave. When people are attacked or insulted, they are more likely to respond with aggression. Crowding is a feeling that there is too little space per person. People in densely crowded cities report feeling more fearful than people in less crowded areas. Even when the city has a lower crime rate, people still feel more uncomfortable on the streets. Researchers have discovered that aroused states, despite the cause of the arousal, will lead to a more aroused state if an emotional cue is introduced. Therefore, anger can lead to sexual passion, as can fear. People are more likely to react with extreme emotions after being stimulated with bright lights or loud noises, like at a rock concert. Research by Leonard Berkowitz has shown that select items can be used as cues to aggression. Berkowitz used a gun to trigger more violent behavior. Anderson found that guns prime hostile thoughts and punitive judgments. Over half of all murders in the United States are committed with handguns. A handgun in the home is more likely to kill household members than intruders, and owners are 2.7 times more likely to be shot, sometimes by their own hand. The United States has 4 times the population of Great Britain and 16 times the murders. The United States has 10,000 handgun killings a year, while Australia has 12 and Canada has 100. Pornography and sexual violence. Researchers have found that violent pornography tends to give men a skewed idea of sexual response and tends to distort individuals' perception of how women actually respond to sexual coercion. Research shows that men who view erotic films have decreased attraction for their partner, have increased acceptance of extramarital sex, have an increased perception of women in sexual terms. While storylines from Gone with the Wind to Down with Love purport that women often say no when they really mean yes, pornography takes romance, and usually foreplay, out of the equation and leaves only the sexual overpowering male overwhelming the resistance of the impassioned female. Depending on the type of pornography, pain, degradation, and injury may be a part of the equation as well. When men watch violent films, it tends to desensitize them to depictions of violence and rape. Studies show that they become unsympathetic of victims of domestic violence and rate the injuries of victims as less severe. Correlational studies of the increase of pornography in rape cases show that as access to pornography increased, the number of rape cases increased at the same time. However, the connection between violent sex crimes and pornography may not be directly drawn. While rapists, child molesters, and serial killers tend to use more pornography than non-offenders, the pornography may be more of a symptom than a cause of their deviance. Interviews with serial rapist Ted Bundy related that he used sexually violent pornography to prime himself for the rapes and murders that followed. It is estimated that 28% of women in the United States have experienced a sexual coercive episode that would fit the criteria for rape. Most didn't label the episode rape because it didn't involve violence or a stranger. Rape statistics in Canada show 23% of the women have been raped. Germany 17%, New Zealand 25%, United Kingdom 19%, South Korea 22%. It is estimated that 75% of stranger rapes are nearly all acquaintance rapes and nearly all of acquaintance rapes go unreported. Surveys of college-age males shows that a full 33% would consider sexual assault if they could be assured that they would never be discovered. Men who are most likely to rape are sexually coercive, dominance demonstrated in their aggression, hostile toward women, sexually promiscuous. In many cases, pornography supports and cultivates this mindset. Televisions are more prevalent in homes than bathtubs or telephones. 2/3 of homes have 3 or more sets. The television is on an average of 7 hours a day. Each member of the family watches an average of 4 hours of programming. Women watch more television than men. Non-whites watch more television than whites. Preschoolers and retired people watch the most. Less educated watch more than the highly educated. 6 in 10 television shows contain violence. Fistfights were long drawn-out affairs, unlike reality where injury usually limits the fight due to a broken jaw or broken hand. 3/4 of the time, the aggressors went unpunished. 58% of the time, the victims were not shown to exhibit pain. Only 5% of violence has shown to have long-term consequences. 2/3 depicted violence as funny. Let's see if we can get this. And if I remember correctly now, it's not available. Okay. Children spend more time watching television than they spend in school. By junior high, the average child has observed 8,000 murders and 100,000 other violent acts. Many supporters of television violence and pornography as well purport that TV violence acts as a cathartic release, actually reducing the amount of violence. Research shows that television desensitizes people to violence. Television also does not represent a realistic world. It tends to have more male characters, 67%, and there are only 51% of male characters people in the world. Most people aren't married, only 10% are married on television, while 61% of the human population is married. Most aren't blue-collar workers, only 25% are blue-collar workers, while the reality is that 67% of the people in the United States are blue-collar workers. Most seem to have no religious affiliation, only 6% admit any religious affiliation, while 88% of people in the United States have some religious affiliation. They consume more alcohol than normal, 45% consume alcohol, while only 16% actually consume alcohol on a regular basis. Surveys of people who watch a great deal of television shows that they view the world as a more violent place than it actually is. They are more fearful of someone coming into their home and more fearful of going outside and being attacked. These individuals also are more likely to read aggression into others' behavior and interpret words as aggressive rather than neutral. Brian Mullen analyzed information from 60 lynchings that took place in the United States between 1899 and 1946 and discovered that the larger the number of people that attended the lynching, the more vicious the murder and mutilation. And this is a form of de-individuation. The similar behavior can be seen with youth gangs, soccer fans, especially in England, with soldiers, urban rioters, school children in Scandinavia. It's called mobbing. The children will repeatedly harass or attack an insecure and weak schoolmate, and it's called mobbing. Mob rules with a pack mentality, even in Scandinavia, among toddlers, as weird as that sounds. European soccer violence. Catharsis. Psychologists suggest allowing people a harmless way to vent their anger and aggression. However, while catharsis seems to work with other emotions, with aggression it just seems to add extra fuel to the fire. Myers sees the only way of reducing aggression is to model and reward sensitivity and cooperation. And that is the end of the lecture for today.